Hey everyone, it's Wednesday, which means we're back for another City Council recap. If Matt and I aren't quite on top of it this week, it's because we were both up pretty late, me watching, but him participating. So yeah, Matt, tell us a little bit about last night.
Yeah, good morning, Liz. It was another long meeting, almost went to midnight. Yeah, it was a good meeting. We covered a lot of ground. We had an open public forum on our budget. So we have an operating budget and a capital budget, and we just took a lot of public comment. We can link to the budget documents, which are posted on the city manager's website, and would certainly love your feedback if you get a chance to go through any of those. A lot of important stuff that we're planning to fund for next year. And I appreciate all the feedback people gave us through our survey a couple of weeks ago. We also got an update on our Climate Smart plan, which tracks how we are reducing emissions over time through different policy levers related to land use and building codes and transportation policy. And we should link to there was an emissions inventory that was really interesting. And I asked a few questions about how we're measuring and how we know as we implement policies whether or not they're working. And of course, I'm always interested in unintended consequences. Do they increase costs or make life less convenient for our residents? So there's a lot of important considerations there, but some really good staff reports that are worth going through if you're interested in our climate smart policy. And then, Liz, there was another small item I thought
it was zoning. It was about urban villages.
That's right. Yeah. So that ended up being the very last item of the night. So it was again pushing midnight, but we were aligning our zoning policies around urban villages to basically just streamline and make it easier for us to build mixed use and attract essentially more jobs, housing, retail to those urban villages, which are meant to be those areas where we have more dense, mixed use, walkable communities within San Jose, which is really where our city should grow in the future. So those were a few items, but not the biggest items.
No, the big item last night was definitely sanctioned encampments. As part of the roadmap process, your memo was lumped together with one from Councilmember Foley. And so city staff looked into what would be involved in creating sanctioned encampments. And that led to a really robust conversation between you and your colleagues and the housing department. So break it down for us, not in 5 hours.
Yeah, it could go 5 hours as it did last night, but okay. So big picture, we have a homelessness crisis. Everybody knows that. 6,000 people plus in San Jose living on our streets, 10,000 in the county, 80% of whom last lived in our county at an address in our county. And it's a growing problem. We are not building housing fast enough to keep up. We know from surveys that a large percentage of the people who are living on our streets are there because they recently lost income, lost a job, or split up with a spouse. Also, we know that there are serious mental health and addiction issues that many of our unhoused neighbors are struggling with, whether causing homelessness or due to homelessness, of course, could be either way. So it's a complex issue. And I think really the way to think about this is there's a continuum of options for addressing the issue. And at one end of the spectrum, which is slow and expensive, is building brand new supportive housing. And most of the county's Measure A money is going to doing that, but it's not keeping pace. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people living in encampments on our streets. And historically, we haven't done a whole lot for them. And increasingly, and this is something that I really pushed for during priority setting, we were talking about addressing the reality on the ground today, not simply waiting 5 or 10 years to build new housing. And we need to do both. We've got to be able to walk and chew gum, as they say.
Yes, and.
Yeah, exactly. So when you talk about that continuum of options, there's sort of two different philosophies. And last night, I think the council reaffirmed the one that I've been championing, but it was an interesting debate. A couple of my who I deeply respect and think are coming from a great place on this advanced a proposal to have staff spend time working on a sanctioned encampment pilot, which would mean the city actually legally sanctioning an area and saying, here's a place where people can camp. The challenge there, of course, that encampment would probably help 100 people, maybe 200 people of the 6,000 in the city. It would be a pilot. The challenge is once we legally sanction an encampment, we're on the hook. If there's a fire, if there's a murder, if there's a theft, whatever it is, we become responsible for that sanctioned space. And therefore, we would need to invest heavily in making that encampment work. We would probably need fencing. We would probably need security. We would need basic infrastructure. We and the taxpayers are now legally on the hook and assuming a certain amount of liability for what happens in that encampment. In fact, San Francisco just had a test case of this where it ended up costing them, by the time they really got it figured out, they were spending over $60,000 per year per person in the encampment. Not a great use of resources when it would be better to be spending that money on actually building transitional housing, mental health treatment facilities, permanent supportive housing, and on and on and on. So that was kind of the long discussion.
Yeah. So what ended up moving forward?
Yeah.
What ended up being because it ended up being a unanimous vote, right?
It did, yeah. So I and some colleagues raised these concerns. I mean, I would support a sanctioned encampment policy, a pilot, if we had identified the location, had the funding ready to go. Ideally, we're doing it in partnership with the county, maybe at the county fairgrounds, sharing the costs, and really thinking about this as an opportunity to learn without detracting from our other efforts. But that wasn't what we were talking about last night. And so I instead made a motion that we postpone sanctioned encampments and until we understand the legal risk. And more importantly, frankly, the biggest thing to me is just trade-offs. We, based on the advocacy that many of us have done for more services and a more sensible policy of creating setbacks and services out in the community to better manage our encampments, we have a bunch of extra money in this budget that we're about to approve that's going to go to porta potties, hand washing stations, caseworker outreach, getting people the care that they need, helping connect them with jobs and housing if it's available, which it often isn't. But I think what we really care about is improving conditions for people on the streets. This question of whether or not we legally sanction it sounds like semantics, but when it comes to legal liability, it makes a huge difference. So I decided to put forward a motion to say, let's double down on increasing services and creating sensible setbacks around sensitive areas like schools and private residences and creeks, hopefully. I mean, we're not quite there in terms of that policy, but we've pushed staff to start with schools, which they're doing. And it ended up being unanimously supported after a very lengthy conversation in which staff told us they don't have bandwidth to do a sanctioned encampment. And if they manage one, it's going to be very expensive and it's going to take away from other homeless services that we want to provide.
Okay, so long story short, not quite sanctioned encampments, setbacks and services. Those services include hand washing stations, mental health services, and junk cleanup, which is
trash removal. Yeah.
Trash removal, which is the other thing you guys talked about. Trash removal. Some of us are removing our trash illegally, and it's costing the city. Yeah. So it's going to start costing them. Tell us about that.
Yes, millions and millions of pounds of illegally dumped trash in our city. So I will try to be succinct. We increased fines, first and foremost, to $10,000 per violation. We talked a bit about enforcement, and frankly, don't have enough of a plan around that, in my opinion. I think we need to invest more in cameras and other ways of enforcing, because a steep fine doesn't matter if we never enforce it, obviously. So we had a conversation around that. And then I thought the most interesting piece was prevention. And so, we should link to the free junk pickup service that the city runs through our third-party providers. So you can call and really easily get your junk picked up. Don't give it to the guy with a pickup truck charging you $20, because it's not going to the dump. It is going to end up illegally dumped in our community, and it's going to cost you as a taxpayer to get it cleaned up. And it's going to make our city look ugly. We talked about dumpsters, which is relevant.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to share with folks.
So a quick little update before we wrap up this recap. We're having our first Neighbor Day this weekend in Shadowbrook. Neighbor Days we took the idea of a dumpster day but made it more like a community gathering, like meet up with your neighbors. So the first one will be in Shadowbrook this weekend in combination with Chat with Matt. So if you don't live in Shadowbrook, you can still tune in for Chat with Matt and hit up the boss with any questions you might have. And we're expanding it to other neighborhoods soon. So if you want to organize one for your neighborhood, email us at district10@sanjoseca.gov and we'll get the ball rolling for you.
Awesome. Yeah. So that takes us to the end of our meeting. It was a long one, but we covered a lot of important topics, and appreciate the opportunity to talk through it with you, Liz.
Yeah, I appreciate the ability to boil this down for people who don't have all evening to watch a city council meeting. But yeah, I'm going to go edit this and you're going to go about your day, and I will talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks so much, Liz. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.